I have said repeatedly that I intend to close Guantanamo, and I will follow through on that. I've said repeatedly that America doesn't torture, and I'm going to make sure that we don't torture.
I think it's simply a recognition of reality that between Obama's policies and Congress's restrictions, nobody's going anywhere soon. All of Guantanamo is arid, except when there's a real rain, which turns things green for a little while. It's dusty. There are cactuses around. There are hills. From an American standpoint, it's similar to the hill country in Texas. You drive along the road toward the camps. You have to go through a checkpoint where guards with automatic weapons are waiting just in case. There is a large camp on your right that used to hold the detainees when there were hundreds of them, 500, 600 of them. They have since been moved, as the size of the population has shrunk, to a maximum security prison modeled on a U.S. maximum security prison, which is meant for isolation. But the administration has allowed the men to operate communally with each other, because that takes some of the pressure off. I won't describe necessarily inside the facility because I want to give you just a sense of the geography. Right next to Camp 6 is Camp 5. It's where the hunger strikers are. It's where the men who have been convicted by military commissions are. It's where men who are being punished are. There is Camp 7, which nobody is supposed to know where it is, which houses the high-value detainees, such as the 9/11 detainees. Then, some distance away, there's the hospital. But the main thing to keep in mind is you drive down the road, and on the left you have these giant, forbidding maximum security prisons that you'd find, say, in Florence, Colorado. And on your left, there really isn't anything in use anymore except for one set of huts that are arranged in a square, which is where detainees meet their lawyers. I was expecting the worst.
Okay.
The men have been on hunger strike for over 3 months. 2 of them are being force-fed.
The Yemenis.
Mm-hmm. The ones who are being force-fed have energy and focus because they're being force-fed.
Mm-hmm.
However, they both lost at least 40 pounds, 40 to 50 pounds. One of them has not taken water voluntarily. The other detainee clients, the Yemenis that I met, were very weak. Took a while for them to come to focus. Demands have grown from simply wanting the authorities to stop searching Korans, which was the demand at the very beginning. Now it's a more general protest against being held without charge, going into their 12th year and with no end in sight. They've made Guantanamo a cause once again, or more precisely, the commanders have made Guantanamo a cause once again, for the reason that they're not talking to the detainees at all. They won't talk to the detainees until the detainees break their hunger strike, and the detainees won't break their hunger strike until the military begins to talk with them. So they're in kind of a standoff. But the current military has the current command has a rather macho approach to this and just isn't going to blink first. But the irony is, they could have solved this hunger strike in 3 or 4 days if they had simply sat down with the detainees and discussed the Koran issue. Instead, they stood fast, they were intransigent, and now they've got a situation where it's really going to be hard to go back to where things were before the hunger strike began.
The hunger strike continues, right?
Yes, the hunger strike continues. It, according to the military, has 100 detainees participating. We think that's a low number. I think I would put the number at about 120, between 120 and 130. But at this point, where the numbers are so close together, it really doesn't make much difference to quarrel about, is it 103 or 107? This is a general hunger strike. It's the longest hunger strike ever at Guantanamo, and it's become the most serious. It may not end until some men die, frankly. There's got to be an end to it. I just don't know how. Perhaps it was seeing Adnan in almost skeletal form, shivering in a chair where he was put to wait for us to visit. It was unbelievable. Adnan is the worst example that I can give you. Adnan had one personality when he was with his brothers, and he had another personality when he was around his guards and in isolation. It was really isolation that bedeviled him more than anything else. His brothers took care of him. He did things for his brothers, but he couldn't abide the authorities. So he would lose no opportunity to make life very hard for the guards and the administration. They didn't know how to handle him. They would ask the guards, the detainees, how do we handle Adnan? He was a very sweet man, if he trusted you. He was a wonderful poet. He wrote beautifully, according to my translators. He was so expressive, but he so often was in complete despair. I don't think any of my other clients reached that point. Yes, they were angry. Yes, they were frustrated. Yes, they were impatient. Sometimes they were gloomy, but they never reached his point of despair. In May 2009, I visited Adnan. We had our normal conversation. My translator was to my left. I was sitting here. The cage that the men are kept in when they're not with their lawyers was also on the left. You are sitting where Adnan sat, and I'm sitting where I sat. And we had a normal meeting. We had brought food, which sometimes is the only thing we can do for them, giving them human food instead of the slop they're eating from the prison. Little containers of things, plastic containers. So we were talking, and at a certain point I saw Adnan moving his hands under the table, and I assumed that he was writing on a piece of paper he had. So we continued to talk. Then he got in an argument with me about whether a certain detainee was still at the camp or had been transferred. And I was arguing with him and he was arguing with me. And then he said, I want to give you something to remember me by. And he had one of my containers filled with his blood. And he threw it at me. Now, what he had done was to chip off the veneer. There's another word for it, I can't remember. Of the table, under the table. Cut his wrist. Let the blood drip into the container. So that's how he did it. Now, if it had been another detainee, another client of mine, I would have been shocked, of course. But in Adnan's case, I was shocked and saddened. And I stood there saying, why did you do that? Why did you do that? And he said, it wasn't against you. It wasn't against you. The blood splashed me from the top of my head down to my knees. So I had to go to the supermarket, which also had clothes that it sold. It's an all-purpose store. Get a new shirt, get new pants. And for months, maybe more than a year, I walked around in sneakers that were bloodstained from him, so that every time I looked at them, I'd be reminded. And from then on out, the camp took very special security measures whenever I met with Adnan. It's a funny thing. On the one hand, they consider the detainees subhuman, and they treat them as subhumans. On the other hand, they also think that they're superhumans who have to be manacled and handled with several guards and kept under the closest watch. Adnan had no privacy, which was one of the things that made him so desperate and miserable. My translator said that when he did it, he had a very strange look in his eyes, as though he wasn't himself. I don't know what motivated him. He was always making gestures to express his misery. And that was probably one of them. We've been in touch with his family every 2 weeks or so. We were the ones who told them that Adnan died. The U.S. government didn't tell them. The Yemen government didn't tell them. ICRC didn't tell them. And so we called up and told them. The brother, Muhammad, who we spoke to, was in a state of shock. When his father came on the line, you have to imagine fire shooting out of his mouth, 30 feet, 40 feet. I can't even begin to tell you. And it's not a surprise. I think that Adnan, apart from Adnan being one of his children, I think that Adnan was the favorite in the family. We asked what the boy, Adnan's son, how he reacted, and he reacted, Papa, I want to see Papa. But it wasn't to be. Unfortunately, it's Pentagon propaganda, and it's stuck. They never tell you who the 28% are. We've been asking for a list for years. How can you believe them when they won't even tell you who they've identified? Secondly, the agencies responsible for collecting this information doesn't even use a consistent set of criteria to determine who it's going to identify. There are 166 men at Guantanamo. 157 have been charged with no offense by the Obama administration. From the standpoint of the administration, the mountain above the clouds in the sky, what are 166 detainees compared to immigration reform, gun control, education reform? It's just not a big issue. It's a big issue as far as principle is concerned. But in terms of practical politics, it's a tick on a camel's back.